Hello, and welcome to episode number 39 of TMC, where we are here to help you take your relationship
From
from surviving
surviving
to
to thriving.
thriving.
Today on TMC, we're going to be discussing lessons we learned in transition.
We were talking about our lives, and as we prepared for the month of April, talking about lessons learned in relationship, lessons learned in marriage. And we thought about times and the many times that our marriage, our relationships, our lives have been in transition.
Right.
So we started to talk about this, and we thought that we would talk to the TMC listeners about the lessons we learned as we transitioned at different levels and different stages in our lives. Different things happened and different things shifted for us as a couple. And so we wanted to talk to them about the different lessons that we learned during that. When we first got married, we got married August 31st,
Yeah.
1998.
September 8th.
September
Yeah.
8th,
I was
1998,
shipped to the
you
military.
left for
Yeah.
basic training.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we started in transition.
Yeah. Man, that's crazy, right?
But we started in transition. So you were talking about we were newly married.
Yeah.
We got married on 31st.
Yeah.
So 8 days later, he's leaving for basic training.
Yeah.
He's gone. And so we started off life that way. We started off our marriage as a long distance marriage
Yeah.
because he was in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and I was still here in Houston. So I was left behind here in Houston while he went to basic training in the times where most people are celebrating that whole honeymoon phase and all of that. We started out with you being away.
Yeah.
And even after that, from basic training, you came home for a month or so for Christmas, and
Yeah.
then you were gone again for AIT.
Yeah.
So I came to Fort Knox, I think it was in April.
Yep. 6 months later. So let's talk about that. So how was that for you?
For me, it was different. And looking back on it, there was some difficult times because it was like I'm married, but my husband's not here.
Yeah.
So I'm married, but I'm not married, kind of, because you're not here. And so everything preparing for our lives to be together, most of those things I was taking care of, getting prepared. What are we going to have for the home? Buying things for the home and managing, learning to manage money
Yeah.
for a whole instead of my oneself, and how I managed money. That's a whole nother podcast. But
Yeah.
anyway, how I managed money. But I was learning to basically learning to care for a home,
Yeah.
even though we didn't have a home yet. So it was a little difficult in the beginning to begin a marriage when you're supposed to be in the whole romantic sweetheart phase.
Yeah. With transition, I mean, sometimes there's frustration.
Oh yeah,
Sometimes
absolutely.
there's confusion. I mean,
Hmm.
you unlearn. I mean, you have to relearn something else because now we're moving into something different. I mean, there was a huge learning curve.
Hmm.
We're married, and now we come together, we become one, and we begin to share together, but we're not
Not together.
together. Yeah, that was
Exactly.
a
And I just thought about that because you said frustration. And for me, it was it there I did experience some frustration in those moments when you were frustrated. It
yeah,
typically caused frustration for me. But for me, my view was completely different because I was still here with all of our family.
yeah,
I was still here going to the same church. I was still here seeing the same people.
yeah.
And your frustration for me came from the times when you were frustrated because there was things that you expected, things that you were looking forward to, such as mail call.
Yeah.
But then I'm still living life almost like it was before we were
Yeah, like
married.
nothing ever
Because
happened.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's really crazy. I mean, really thinking about that. So therefore, we get married, and I made a transition, but you
mhm,
didn't make a transition. I mean, life
exactly.
didn't even change for you, but it changed for me.
At that
So
moment, yeah.
yeah, so at
Mhm.
the moment, I mean, life, I believe, with transitions like that, those major transitions. Sometimes, for me, that was a transition physically, but what about the transition that happened mentally?
Mentally.
We
Mhm.
somebody's transitioning mentally in their mind, but their spouse is not
Mhm.
transitioning with them. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, there could be frustration because we're in two different places, and one person is still the same, which
Mhm.
was you, and I was in a different
Mhm.
situation. Life is changing.
Absolutely. And while you're talking, I'm thinking about this. It can also happen for a couple, even if you're together and you're still, say, for instance, you're together and you're married, you move, you now wedding day is over, your honeymoon is over, you come home, you move to your apartment or your house or whatever, and say one person has not mentally transitioned because they're still at their mama house every day.
Yeah.
They still going
Wow.
to visit their family every day.
Yeah.
They're
Still
still
hanging out
hanging
with
out with their
friends. Yeah.
friends every day,
Yeah.
and then the spouse is sitting at home waiting, like, I cook
Mm.
dinner, or I'm waiting
Mhm.
for you to show up,
Yeah.
and you over at your sister's house, and I'm waiting to spend time with you.
Yeah.
So while you were talking, I thought about that. It was different for us because we were miles apart. So we're learning to build a life, but we're apart.
Yeah.
Versus there are sometimes in relationships and marriages when a couple can be together and one person has transitioned
Mm.
both physically and mentally,
Another
and
person
the
still
other
the same.
person
Yeah.
transitioned physically but not mentally,
Yeah.
because they're still connected to their original immediate family. They're
Right.
still connected to
Yeah.
home. They're still running home every day, or they're still
Yeah.
hanging out with
Yeah.
friends every day.
Yeah.
And they find it mentally difficult to
Wow.
disconnect and then connect over here. So that's a lesson, and that could definitely cause some frustration.
We said I do, but still some things that haven't changed.
Yeah,
There's still some things that's still the same. I want my cake and eat it
eat it
too.
too.
And it's like, I want both. I want to still remain single in a sense,
Mm,
and I want to remain married at the same time. And I believe that's one of the things for a transition,
hmm.
even for newlyweds. I mean, that's a really big transition when now I used to have everything to myself, and now I have to share. I
Absolutely.
have to share my time. This
Hmm.
this time when I was single, my time was my time.
My time.
Now I got
Hmm.
to share my time.
Hmm.
Now before I spend money, now I have to consult with
Hmm.
my
Yeah,
spouse versus at first I
just
didn't have
buying
to
what I want
answer
to
to
buy.
anyone.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
like, okay, if I wanted to move to California, I don't have to talk to anybody. I just make my move.
And then transitioning to moving with you. So now we're a couple, and
Mm,
now we're located in the same place. And because I started out married, but I was still with family,
yeah.
now I'm way away from family and I'm with you. That's when frustration happened for me, because it's
Ah,
like
yeah.
I'm still connected to family. So I'm not seeing them every day.
Yeah.
I'm not with them every day like I was. I'm with you.
Yeah.
And so life is supposed to be with you, but I'm still calling. I'm spending all my time on the
Yeah.
phone calling
Eh,
everybody from home because I'm missing them not
Yeah.
being there.
And that was a big issue because I
Yes, it
mean, when
was.
early on, I mean, we didn't have
Spend a
much
lot of
money,
money
and you spending money on
calling home.
calls,
Yeah,
and it was like,
yeah.
wow, man. I mean, it's even in that situation, I mean, decisions that
Had to be
had to be
made.
made,
Yeah, a
adjustments.
conversation had to be had, and we made a decision together as a couple. And also thinking about, there were also times when I was should have been spending time with you, and I was spending time on the phone connecting to the people that I now left behind. And
Mm.
so even with that, thinking about that as far as a relationship and a couple, when it comes to the relationship, you have friends, family, or whoever that you normally did certain things with, and you did it without having to consult with anyone. You did it without having to be concerned for anyone else. You could hang out with your mom as long as you wanted to without having to think about someone at home waiting for you.
Yeah.
You didn't have to do those things. And so for me, it was a transition within a transition, because now I'm here with you, but there's a part of me that's still back there with them, and we're thousands of miles away from them. So I got to make some changes. And the
Mm.
phone thing just happened to be one thing that was costing us financially,
Yeah.
because I'm calling everybody. I want to talk to everybody every day,
Yeah.
like I'm still in Houston, and not evaluating that there's a cost to that
Yeah,
now.
and that's the thing. So you have to come to a point, in your marriage, especially in the beginning, to
Hmm.
love them, but be able to leave
Yeah,
them.
leave and
Yeah,
cleave.
right. Yeah, it's a hard thing to do because not only for the person that's married, but for the family member.
Hmm.
The family member now has a different because now I'm used to you was my
Hmm.
baby.
Yeah,
You're my son.
yeah,
You're my daughter.
yeah.
You're mine. And
Hmm.
now you have to give that mine up to
To
somebody
somebody
else.
else.
You have to
Yeah.
relinquish
Hmm.
something, a relationship that you were comfortable with, a relationship that you had, and now you got to share this relationship that she was my baby.
Yeah.
She's been my baby for 18 years.
Yeah.
She's been my baby for 25 years.
Yeah.
I've been hanging out. We've been spending time together.
Yeah.
This is my baby. This is my son.
Or my
He's been with
friend.
me for 30 years. This is my friend. This is my best friend. We went to elementary together. We ate lunch together. We
Yeah.
played softball together.
We
We
hang
played
out every
football together.
Friday.
We went out together. We did good and bad together. And we went to church together and, all these different things. And now that somebody else went into the space, and again, transition
Mhm.
causes conflict.
Yeah. Transition, frustration. Yes, yes, yes. Trust and believe
Yeah.
there will be
Will be.
frustration
Will be.
in transition. What we have to acknowledge is that the frustration means that something is changing. It means
Mm,
that something is happening outside of the norm.
yeah.
It means that something is different than maybe even what you expected, or
Mm,
something needs to be different than what you expected.
yeah.
So the frustration, you have to see it as an indicator. This is not a sign to run, it's not a sign to give up, it's not a sign to say, oh, I shouldn't have done this. No, the frustration that you experience in transition, especially in the beginning of your marriage, in the beginning of that coming shall become becoming
Yeah.
one, in the
Yeah.
beginning of that frustration that you feel says pay attention. It's like the indicator light that comes on the dashboard to let you know to pay attention. And
Mm,
that's the way we have to see it. Don't see it as a bad thing. We're telling you that there will be frustration,
yeah.
and so now you have the wisdom and the knowledge to see it as an indicator.
Yeah. And you can plan for it.
Exactly.
Because now you realize, oh, this is totally normal. This is a
Absolutely.
normal thing that happened. This is a part of the process to get to where we need to go. I mean, you have to think about a cake. All that mix has been put in, the eggs has been put in, and everything else that goes through baking the cake. And then the batter has to be beat up. Well, if the cake was a human, the cake understand that that beating is a part of the
The
process.
process.
But eventually, after that, now it got to go through some heat and
Hmm.
eventually come out to its final stage on what it's supposed to be. Even at the end, it get a little icing on it. Yeah.
I like that. I like,
So here
yeah.
we are, 4 years in the military, and now it's time to transition again.
Yes.
At 4 years, we became comfortable
Oh yeah.
of
There's a
being
life in
away.
Fort
Our
Knox.
life,
Hmm.
we create new life with
Friends.
new friends. And when
So in that transition, I think about what actually happened. So
mhm.
you remained in Fort Knox
Wow,
for the
again,
remainder. Yeah, you remained in Fort
yeah,
Knox for the remainder. I left in May. You stayed in Fort Knox until July, and I came here, kind of set up what
yeah,
was going to be our life here. And in that transition, that meant that I came here, and I was living with someone else, and I'm looking for work,
mhm.
and things like that, just preparing to set up. And so I think that time was different, not the same frustrations as before.
And this is what's so cool about it. Once you experience transition once,
Once, then you know how to operate in
transition
it.
becomes
Yes.
easier. I think the
Uh-huh.
worst part is the first transition.
Yeah.
The
Mhm.
first transition is always the hardest one because you don't know how to react to it.
Yeah.
But now, once you get some transitional experience,
Experience.
things get easier. So now we
Yeah.
begin to plan, and now we set goals and we set expectations that we didn't the first time.
Oh yeah,
So now we're
absolutely.
expecting. So now I know what it feels like that, what, I'm gonna have to tough it out. I'm gonna be here by myself
By
for three
myself.
months
Yeah.
without my wife, but because I know there's an end result,
Yeah.
I know there's a target, I know there's light at the end of the tunnel, so I'm looking at things different. The first time, first transition, I couldn't
Caught you
see the
off
light
guard.
at the end of the tunnel. Now I know it's a light. So things are different. So now again, I have the experience and the transition is different. So here's another lesson. As time go by, the transition will get easier. The
Hmm.
first transition may be the hardest
Hmm.
transition if it's done appropriately.
We want the TMC listeners to understand the first time we I knew you were going to the military, you knew that, but we didn't know, and there was no one telling us
We
that.
didn't
We didn't
plan.
know, what was going to come with it.
Uh,
But the second
we,
transition, well, the third transition, when we were coming back to civilian life and we're coming back to Houston, we talked about that.
yeah, we
So
planned
we
it.
talked about what it was going to look like for us, when I was going to leave, and what I was going to be doing. So
Mhm.
there was a whole, so you had a picture in your
Yeah,
head.
yeah,
It's not that, my wife is not here and what is she doing, what's going on, or
yeah,
my husband's over there, what is he doing, what's
yeah,
going on. You have so many months
Yeah.
left in the military. You're going to be here to pack up the house for when the movers come and blah, blah, blah. We have a little bit more information this transition, so it makes it a little smoother. So, what that says to me is a lesson learned is that if we have more information, this transition can be a little bit smoother. So, if we know that a transition is coming, having more conversations about that transition, if we know that a transition is possible, discussing what that looks like for us. If we know that a transition is approaching, discussing or laying out how we're going to do this, how it's going to, even like we just talked about a couple getting married. So while you're doing your coaching session or your premarital counseling or whatever you're
Mhm.
doing, think about what it's going to look like for her to be leaving her parents' home. Think about what it's going to look like for him to be, if he's not already on his own, leaving his parents' home. Think about what it's going to look like hanging with friends, point forward, and discuss those things. Talk about what you're expecting. And, I'm expecting us to have dinner together every night. Okay, maybe not every night, maybe 3 times a week,
Mm.
things like that. So when you're discussing and when you have a plan can make your transition go a lot smoother.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's the thing. So we came here
Hmm.
and we transitioned, and that transition was better.
Hmm.
26 years old when we bought our first house.
Yep.
Here is another thing.
Another
Again,
transition.
first house transition, and that was a lot of mistakes made. A
Hmm.
lot of mistakes made, a lot of things we didn't
Didn't
know.
know.
And to be honest, at the end of the day, it
Yeah.
didn't go the way we expected, because
Yeah.
of the way it was planned.
And we were in debt. We had a lot of debt. So after we decided to sell the home, and we're going to sell the home, and we're going to get out of debt. Before that, we had a 2-year transition where both of us decided that we were going to do a lot more work. So you were traveling a lot for work,
Oh yeah.
and I was working a lot of overtime.
Yeah.
You were gone, and I stayed at work while you were gone.
Yeah.
So that was a transit. That was like 2 years worth of
Yeah.
transitioning to
With a
change.
goal.
Yes,
We had a
with a
goal.
goal in
Yeah.
mind and a plan.
Yeah.
So that transition was a lot smoother. I don't even really remember any frustration, but we experienced a lot less frustration because, again, we sat down and we talked
Yeah.
about what the next 2 years were going to. We gave ourselves a time,
Yeah.
and we were like, we have to do everything we have to do to get out of this in the next two
Yeah.
years. So thinking about a transition that's taking place. So we know that our life is shifting, but it has a set time to come to an end. So when there's something like that, sometimes someone is going back to school, sometimes someone is taking on a new career, sometimes someone is getting a degree or something of that nature, because there's going to be a transition. So maybe we spend a lot of time together, but if my wife is going to school for nursing, then she's not going to be at home cooking as much, but
Yeah.
we're discussing that before.
Yeah.
So when we knew in those 2 years, that 2-year time frame, what we were doing, we knew what we were working towards, the transition again was a lot smoother. We may have experienced some bumps along the road. There may have been some times when we wanted to be together, but we were separate again because he was working out of town and I'm working here in Houston. But because we knew we had a plan, you could endure those moments and that time knowing that, like you said, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So you know that it's going to end.
Sum it all up. Have some goals.
Yeah.
Have some goals.
Mhm.
Measurable goals, smart goals. Yeah.
Time
So what
based.
you want to do? You want to start some smart goals. I mean, so the first thing, I mean, you want to be specific,
Hmm.
specific in the plan. I mean, we were very specific. We
Exactly.
said we're doing this.
For
You know,
two
2 years,
years.
two
Hmm.
years, and we knew exactly what we was going to do and why we was going to do it. Then after that, I mean, it has to be measurable.
Hmm.
Measurable. Measuring the
Measuring the
progress.
outcome. We
Yeah.
knew. We knew what bills we had. We wrote down how much we owed on everything. We wrote down, we even talked about how long it would take to pay each one of them off. We talked about what we would do with all the extra money we had. Yeah, everything was measurable.
Yeah, and then it had to be obtainable.
Hmm.
Like, man, can we really get this done?
Yes.
Can we really get this done? And all these things, and we're saying that's all these things is what made it go a smooth transition.
Hmm.
And then we accomplished the goal we wanted.
Yes.
So all that was done. I mean, then the thing about it had to be relevant.
Hmm.
It had to be relevant. Is this relevant to our life? Is this relevant to what we're trying to do?
Our
We
future.
right.
Hmm.
And then time based.
Hmm.
Time based was okay. We're starting here in 2 years. We're gonna pay off our debt. We're gonna do this, and we accomplish the mission. And now we can
Absolutely.
move on and have a normal life.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Until the next
yeah,
transition.
yeah.
So then the next transition.
Uh-huh.
In the next transition, we sold our first home
Mm.
and we moved into a rental property
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
So now at that point in time, oh my goodness, a lot was going on in our lives. We were
Mm.
both working full time. You were now a pastor. You were going to the College of Biblical Studies,
Yeah.
and so you were working during the week, going to school, church, and we moved into a rental
Jeez.
property. We moved into that rental
Sure.
property to continue paying off bills as well as to save
Uh-huh.
for our future and what we were planning on doing. And again, I would repeat the same thing. That transition was a lot smoother. It did take time for us to adjust. Listen, because we went from a home that was one size to a home, we
You
downsized.
had
So we
downsize.
went to a home that was smaller. I mean, so but we made that transition because we knew that it wasn't permanent. So
We
what
knew that it was light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So sometimes in relationships, sometimes in your marriage, sometimes you will have to make a transition that's temporary. Sometimes you'll have to make a transition because it's going to be better for your future. Sometimes you'll have to make a transition because that transition is going to set you up for what's next. And that's what we were doing in that particular transition. When
Yeah.
we sold our home in spring and we moved into a rental property, we said to ourselves 12 more months, we'll be done. We'll be done paying off everything in a couple of months. And then that'll give us the remainder of the year to save,
Yeah.
to prepare for what we're going to do next.
Mm.
And next, we are going to, purchase another home, move forward, blah, blah, blah. But we had a plan. Again, we talked it out, we
Yeah.
worked it out. We had a time base. We had all of the everything that he said in the SMART goals. We had it again.
Yeah.
So with that in place, it made the transition a little smoother. Not that each and every moment of that transition was comfortable,
Right.
which is another point or another lesson learned, that sometimes even in a transition that will turn out to be better for you, there will still be some spots that are be a little bit uncomfortable
Mm.
because we had to live in a place that was smaller. We had to adjust to our schedule. We had to adjust even to spending time together because again, we had so much going on, but we knew that this is time based. So we know that this is going to be for a certain time.
Yeah.
And with that being said, it made it easier, but it didn't stop it from being uncomfortable sometimes. So that's something we want to note, that even in a planned transition, even when you talk it out, even when you have a plan, even when you
Still
have
friction.
smart goals, there's still
Still
going to be a
friction.
little friction
Yeah.
and there's going to be a little bit of uncomfortability.
Yeah.
So that's going to happen.
Then we got to the moment where we did another transition, which the home we live in now,
Mm-hmm.
we purchased this house, and then the same thing again. Second time, better. Second time, all the mistakes from the first time
We
were
didn't make them
corrected on
this
this
time.
time. Yeah,
Yes. Yep. And I like that you said that. And it's so true. Life is full of transitions. If I promise you, if you just take a moment and think about your life over the last 5 years,
mm,
you've had many transitions
many.
inside of your relationship. There's going to be transition. There's going to be shifting. There's going to be changes. Somebody will change jobs. Somebody will change careers. Someone may go back to school. Someone could get sick. You may have children. You may have someone, a family member or a parent, come to live with you or something like that. Or you may have to go live with your parents. Transition happens. And when transition happens, what you want to do as a unit is you want to sit down and you want to make some goals. You want to make some plans. You want to talk about, what does this look like for us? How long is this going to last? What are we going to do? What is our plan? What is the ultimate outcome? What do we want to gain from this?
Yeah.
Where do we want to be when we get to the end of this? What is next for us? So we talk about and talk through all of those things and we have a plan. But to know that if life happens or if a situation arises, that we come back together and we reevaluate the plan and we adjust as needed so we can make a transition inside of a transition if necessary.
In our marriage, I mean, one of the things we had to do, we had to learn to be comfortable with transition.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the hardest things to do because we want to know everything going on, how it's
On all the
going. We
details.
want the details, but really embracing the fact of there will be transitions.
Mhm.
Life is full of swift transitions.
Absolutely. And I think is the other thing is knowing that when you become comfortable with knowing that transitions will happen, you keep a level head. So when something comes, your way in a relationship, in your marriage, then you understand, okay, there's some transition happening here. Our lives is shifting. Something is happening. There's times when it will be in your control,
No.
things that you can control. And then some transitions are out of your control. They are beyond your control. Things happen. So when that happens, you have to make yourself comfortable with those that are outside of your control, because the more comfortable you become with the transition and know that it's many things are only for a season. Some things are for a lifetime. A transition such as having a child, that's for a lifetime. You go from being single to being married, that's for a lifetime. You go from being just the two of us to the three of us or the four of us or the five of us, that's a transition that's for a lifetime. And then some transitions are temporarily, like moving to a new home, a new apartment, traveling, changing jobs, going back to school, a change in career. Some of those things are for a certain season in time. So being comfortable with transition. And we began to do that. That's something that made us want to talk about this. When we were talking about lessons learned, our life, even today, our life is still in
Yeah.
transition.
Transition from the corporate.
Absolutely. Our life is still in transition. And this is the thing. In March of 2020, we had lined up and planned one transition, but God changed all of that and our lives transitioned, but it transitioned differently.
No.
And so we also, as believers, want to be open and comfortable with allowing God to transition us how he wants to transition us. So even if we have a plan that this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, this is what's going to happen in the next 2 years, or this is what we want to do in the next 5 years, being open to the leading of the Holy Spirit, being open to God's plan superseding our plan. And when God makes that shift, because we've experienced transition so much and we've learned to be comfortable with transition, when he makes a transition, when he makes a
We
shift,
go with it.
we say, okay.
We
Oh,
go
so
with
this
it.
is the way we
Yeah.
going. Shift. Oh, okay, so that's the way we going. And then when we start going that way, now we're coming back together and we're
No.
adjusting. And now we got to adjust our plan because the plan over here, the what's happening has changed. So now we got to adjust our plan so that we can go with his plan, and we can because his plan is always greater than ours and we want to go with his plan. So we want to get on the right shift and get in the right atmosphere to go with what God is doing. And for that to happen, you got to be comfortable with transition. Because if not, in the times when I have found myself in a transition and I'm like, whoa, I wasn't ready for this. That's it takes a little bit longer to get comfortable. You might, just like we talked about in the beginning of our marriage, I think we experienced more frustration because
We
and
didn't
we didn't
understand what comes with transition.
exactly. And we didn't know anything thinking about what the outcome was. The things that
Mm.
we know today we look at everything and understand that there's a time and a season for all things. And because we know that whatever season that we're in, we know that it's going to change.
No.
And there's going to be a shifting again. So what we're going to do is we're going to work this season to the best of our ability and for to work it as a win for us, and then we're going to be ready to move with the next transition.
No. Constantly. This year was huge
Mhm.
transition, things we didn't even
Expect.
expect.
Hmm.
But then the outcome was way better than we can ever imagine.
Absolutely.
And so, just really getting comfortable with the transition and not fighting against it.
Hmm.
Because if you're fighting against it, you could just be fighting against your destiny.
Wow.
Never get to see.
Never get to see the fullness of what was supposed to be, because you got lost in that moment.
No,
You veered off when you should have kept going straight. You veered off, or you were so adamant about sticking
no,
to your plan that you couldn't see the greater plan and how it worked out for you. If we didn't learn to get comfortable with transition, we would have had
no.
a lot of problems.
So man, I'm loving this space. I'm loving this space and just excited for what God has for our life and also what God has for your life. Go
Absolutely.
with the transition, shift with the transition,
Yeah.
move with the transition, walk with the transition. If it shift left, you shift with it. Shift right, you shift with it. Stop fighting against it.
We want to thank you for joining us today on TMC. If you found this information helpful, then don't forget to subscribe. Turn on your notifications, click the like button so that you will be notified every week when we upload a video. And if you're listening on iTunes, rate the podcast and leave a review. That helps us get the word out. And we want to invite you to head on over to our leadership podcast, Lead to Greatness, where my husband is interviewing entrepreneurs and great leaders from all around the world.
So we want to thank you for joining us today on TMC. Looking forward to hanging out with you again on next week as we continue to help you take your relationship from surviving to thriving. Bye. See you next week.